Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. And this is about the right level?
Yes.
Of course, if you can hear me, you can answer that question. If you can't hear me, but there we go. Well, what I'm going to be talking about tonight is healthcare and Christian ethics. It's a subject that has occupied me for a long time now, and let me explain that I'm the son of a doctor, the grandson of a doctor. I'm married to a doctor. Doctors are very evangelical about other people their children becoming doctors. Are any doctors here? No, that's unusual. Usually is a doctor in the audience. However, I escaped to do theology, and in the end of the day, marrying a doctor, or at least a medical student, pleased my father. He was pleased about that. So the Dr. Gilbert continues in the form of my wife. She was a GP and worked in Sittingbourne for quite a number of years. I taught at the University of Kent for 20 years, and altogether taught in universities for 40 years, first at Edinburgh, then at Newcastle, and then finally at University of Kent. Although I've always been an active priest as well, and I'm now in retirement, I still sort of help out. We spent much of our life in Gibraltar. May is warm enough for us to come back, so it caught me on one of our visits to England. My father was Gibraltarian, and my family go back there for 250 years. And I help out at the cathedral when I'm there in Gibraltar. When I'm here in Kent, I help out in our local parish here. One of the things that I found is that I was developing an interest in medical ethics, which perhaps isn't surprising given my background. Christian ethics was one of the areas that I taught in university, and medical ethics, as one or two of you remember, is one of the areas that I taught. I don't teach any longer. I still write books and I still do research, but I am still on a number of medical ethics committees, and that brings me back to England at regular intervals. I'm still on the BMA Ethics Committee. I've been on that now for 16 years, believe it or not. It's a very, very interesting committee to belong to. It's a great privilege to be part of that. It does make a difference. It makes a difference. I mean, the BMA has been in the news recently, probably for the wrong reasons, going on strike. But the Ethics Committee does have effect upon government policy. On the whole, governments don't like to be on the wrong side of doctors on questions of medical ethics. It's an extremely well-resourced committee. For most of the time I've been the only theologian on that. We're surrounded by philosophers and lawyers and of course doctors as members of it. And I'm usually the only theologian there. But I'm glad they still want to have a theologian on it, and it's been a privilege to continue. You get appointed from year to year, so I never know how long I'm going to be there. Every year I think, oh, well, that might be my last year, they might be fed up with me. But so far, so good. I've been on the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. You do have to come off that. I did my 6 years on that, and that's another wonderful committee, which are really deeply at the heart of some of the most difficult ethical questions are being raised, and again with an effect on government committee, on government views. And I'm not on that anymore. I'm an affiliate of that. I am still on one of the colleges, and I'm still on the Medical Research Council's Stem Cell Bank Steering Committee. I've been on that for 11 years now. So as you can hear, I'm sort of deeply involved in medical ethics. And the question I found that I was asking, after a while, the first few years, and when you're doing it and you're on these committees, you've got to work quite hard because you've got to keep up with the medical case studies and learn the vocabulary of the medics. You've got to keep up with the lawyers and the changes in law that are happening, because after all, in all those committees we're having an effect upon law. And there are many deep philosophical and theological questions that are raised in medical ethics. But for a while, I thought, well, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here, what it is they want from me. I suppose to begin with, I thought, well, maybe I'm on there to represent religious minorities. I actually found that wasn't a very good answer, because the committee secretariat usually knew much more about religious minorities and their unusual ethical stances on things like blood donation and Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, than I did. So I don't think I was there to represent religious minorities. Another answer that I thought for a long time worked, and I think it still does, is that why did they want a theologian in the first place? Well, maybe it's because a theologian has something to bring which is a little bit different from the philosophers and lawyers, in the sense that, particularly if we're still engaged in parishes, as I am, there's quite a bit in common with doctors at that level. An ethical problem isn't just an ethical problem for me. As a priest, an ethical problem is people. And people that come into my remit as a priest at a pastoral level. So maybe they wanted somebody who knew the technical arguments, but also somebody who had the pastoral instincts that good doctors do have, and good priests do have, but isn't necessarily part of being a philosopher or a lawyer. I think that worked as an answer, and it's probably is the answer, or at least one of the answers. But I wanted to know something more than that. I wanted to know if there was anything intellectual that I was bringing to medical ethics, which wouldn't really normally occur to philosophers particularly, or even lawyers. Now, academics tend to get sabbaticals every now and again, after I'd been involved in this for about 8 or so years, I had a sabbatical. I'd accumulated a sabbatical, so I had 6 months off, just to do pure research. And I thought, well, I think it's time I gave some serious thought to what it is that might be distinctive about a Christian theologian coming to medical ethics issue, which is different from what a philosopher or a lawyer might contribute, but might also be important and appropriate for doctors. So, and this might strike you as odd, I spent the 6 months doing nothing but studying the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke particularly, and the healing stories. I looked at some other theologians talking about medical ethics, and they usually sort of batted on about St. Paul. And I couldn't really understand why, because Paul doesn't really talk about healing. And I couldn't understand why they spend so much time talking about St. Paul's relevance to medical ethics. And I always found their explanations extremely baffling. So I thought, well, why don't they look at Jesus? I mean, Jesus' ministry, very much so in the Matthew, Mark and Luke, rather less so in John, but in Matthew, Mark and Luke, Jesus' ministry is a central part of that ministry involves healing. So I thought, well, I'm going to do nothing but study these texts in the Greek and in parallel versions and try to see if it doesn't suggest something to me which is distinctive about what a Christian theologian might be able to contribute to the very concept of healing. Now, I was aware that my colleagues were largely using the four principles approach, not entirely, but largely, what is called the four principle approach in medical ethics. These are the four principles of autonomy, non-maleficence, I'm sorry about that word, beneficence and justice. Non-maleficence, not doing harm, beneficence, doing good, autonomy, self-control of the person, the patient being in control, and justice. Justice is a rather easier word, at least in principle. So just to take those four principles, the principle of not doing harm, non-maleficence, is a very obvious one in terms of medic. If you go to your doctor, you really don't expect your doctor to be doing harm to you, do you? I mean, if you did find a doctor who was doing harm, I mean, somebody completely mad like Hal Shipman, I'm sure most of us agree that was an extremely bad doctor in every possible sense. So the very minimum you expect from a doctor, they don't do harm. You probably do expect that they'll actually do good. But one of the ironies is that almost everything doctors do to you, involving medicine or surgery, does you harm as well. So the very few pills you can take that don't have some side effects that are going to harm you. So most of us want to see some kind of balance between harm and good. That most of us expect that if we go to a doctor and we have a form of treatment, that treatment will do more good for us than harm. And medicine and surgery particularly, I mean all surgery is about invasion of the body, but as I say, most drugs also have side effects, harmful side effects. And if they don't think they've got them, they might discover them in the future as well. So what you want, presumably, when you go to a doctor is for them to assess with you what a particular drug or surgical intervention, what good it's going to do to you, at what cost. It's going to do some harm, but if the harm is greater than the good, then you presumably don't have the treatment. If the good is greater than the harm, then most of us do. So at one level, that's a very simple principle, and those two principles together, non-maleficence and beneficence. The principle of autonomy says something more than that, and that's really a product of modern medicine over the last generation or more. And that, in terms of patient autonomy, it says that patients expect to have a doctor keeping confidences and to be giving them choices. And that if they finally say they don't want a particular medical intervention, however much the doctor wants to give it to you, then we all have the right to say no. We all always have a choice. If we have capacity, we always have a choice, because we can always say no. We can't always say, I'll have this treatment rather than that treatment. Doctors are not always responsive to that, although they may give you that choice. But even if they don't give you a choice in treatments, you can always say no, and that in itself is a choice. The principle of autonomy is deeply embedded in medical ethics and medical law today. It wasn't in the past. I mean, I remember my father, who was, I think, a very good doctor, a very caring doctor, and a very clever doctor. I don't think he really believed in the modern sense of patient autonomy. He was adopted the attitude, as did most doctors at the time, is that he'd been trained in medicine and the patients hadn't, and that it was finally his choice, not their choice, in terms of choosing what treatment to give the patient. Nowadays, I think none of us expect that from a doctor. We expect a doctor to not only explain what the treatment is, but to explain what the choices are, and what the upsides and what the downsides of that treatment are. My father regarded it, I think, as a burden upon patients, as did most people at the time. We've radically changed on that, and we've now, most of us, come to the conclusion that that really is what we expect from our doctor, that we really do expect a doctor to give us a choice, even if that choice becomes a burden to us. So even if we go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, actually there is a 5% risk of X, well, you'll die basically, or something like that, or you'll make you 100 times worse. But now, I must warn you about that. It's your choice whether you want that patient with a treatment and take that risk or not. Now, I'm sure all of you will feel that when you go to see your doctor. You expect to have that kind of information. And in any case, even if the doctor doesn't give it to you, I'm sure you're all furiously on the internet looking up your various complaints, as we all do, and looking up what the options are. And good doctors today often say that. My wife used to say to people, go away and look it up yourself. And here are the appropriate websites. So if you really want the technical one, you really want the best one, go to NICE. Indeed, whenever I've had anything, I go straight to the NICE reports and see what the balances are. And that gives me the technical information about what is the most successful kind of intervention, what is the one with the highest risk, what's the one with the lowest risk, and what the prognosis might be. So we all do that now, or if you're not doing it directly, I'm sure your family are, when for you. So in that sense, choice has become absolutely crucial to medical practice today, patient choice. And associated with that is the doctor keeps confidences, that you don't expect the doctor to go talking to others. You expect the doctor to keep confidences. For a short while in the Scottish Borders, I was the local priest and my wife was the local GP. And they used to sort of test us out, and they'd say to me, well, of course, you'll know from your wife that I've got X. And I said, no, I certainly don't know that. We don't talk about each other. I want to treat you as a person, not as a patient. And it probably worked the other way around for her as well. But have a barrier which you didn't talk about, that was absolutely essential. Patient confidentiality is an essential part of modern medicine. So autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Justice in raising the issue that doctors do, of course, treat patients, but in a finite world, they are faced with certain problems about distribution as well. We can't all have everything we want. There is a question of who is the most needy, who really deserves the treatment most, or merits the treatment most rather than deserves. In transplants, that's become absolutely essential to make those kind of choices. Heart transplants are enormously successful, but involve a scarce resource. Only about a quarter of the people who might benefit from a heart transplant can receive one because of the availability of hearts for donation. I mean, looking at it from the doctor's point of view, we've made our roads too safe. So not enough hearts are available. In the days of more dangerous cars, there were more hearts available. But looking at it from our perspective, we know that there are difficult decisions there in terms of who will finally receive a heart when the heart becomes available. Difficult decisions like that. Difficult decisions in terms of fertility treatment. At what stage does one stop providing fertility treatment, for example, on the NHS? Given that there are more and more forms of treatment, more and more experimental forms of treatment, how much, if any, do we actually allow patients? Expensive drugs, expensive cancer drugs, which have extremely expensive, but have a limited effect upon the treatment of cancer, for example. Again, at what price do we give patients? How much benefit do we actually, can we justify for a particular patient in terms of the overall cost of drugs? It's one of the most difficult areas of medical ethics, that of priorities, or rationing, if you want to call it the ghastly term rationing. It probably is the most difficult area. Now, these four concepts together seem to me to be very good and very important. Some theologians don't, and I know some theologians argue against autonomy, for example, and say it's a form of selfishness. I just don't believe them. I don't believe that when they go to a doctor and the doctor pats them on the head and says, no, don't worry about this, let me make the decision, and I needn't explain this to you and I'll just make the decision for you. I bet they get straight out the surgery, as we all would, I hope. No, I do believe in all these four principles, but they don't strike me as quite enough of what I think is involved in medical ethics. And that's where I started looking at the Gospels, trying to see what Jesus did, what Jesus in the Gospels did when people who were ill approached him. And there are quite a number of stories of this. We had one in our lection last week in the Gospel, and they occur frequently, as you know. After the end of 6 months of study of this and trying to compare, I began to notice certain patterns beginning to establish themselves in terms of what was typically in a healing story. most of them started with compassion. With not compassion, somebody who's in extreme need, crying out to Jesus to have mercy on him or her. And Jesus responding. Compassion struck me as just so obvious when you start looking at the stories. Mercy is probably the wrong translation of the Greek word in that particular context. Compassion is a rather better one. Have compassion on me rather than just have mercy. Mercy implies a judicial sense. The compassion, though, is a bit more than that. Compassion, properly understood, I think, involves a number of features. It involves feeling for the other person, empathy. It involves taking that person extremely seriously. And it also, compassion, involves trying to actually do what you possibly can to help that other person. The Greek word, I won't use too many Greek words tonight, but the Greek word splagnetste is an interesting word. Its literal meaning is the person's guts were moved. It's here. Now, for the ancient mind, particularly the Greek mind, this was the place of emotions. It's not difficult to see why. And it's a very strong word. It occasionally occurs in healing stories, not very often. It occurs more regularly in some of the healing parables. The Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son both have this word at the very centre of the two parables, both in Luke's Gospel. The father sees the prodigal son and has mercy, splagnetste, for him. The Samaritan sees the person who's been robbed and again has splagnetste, compassion upon that person. The Good Samaritan is actually a very good story because it tells you all those things. A person reaches out to somebody who's obviously in need and then not just does something about it, but actually pays out of his own money and own resources and reaches out to that person to try to right a clear wrong and to help somebody in clear and obvious need. Now this struck me as interesting, that the stories usually begin with this, and important, because that's exactly what I notice in my own family and from looking at other doctors and nurses. Many of them became doctors or nurses precisely for compassionate reasons. Perhaps somebody was ill in their family. Perhaps they felt a strong need to help other people in deep need. But when you actually sort of ask healthcare workers, doctors particularly, why they became a doctor in the first place, the word compassion quite often occurs spontaneously and very properly. And yet, I could find very little evidence in the literature on medical ethics of the word compassion having any function at all. I remember being told by some of the lawyers at the time that it's not a legal word, has no meaning in legal terms. Actually, that has now changed. It was used in the Director of Public Prosecution's guidelines on assisted dying. He started with the word compassion, very unusually, because it wasn't really part of the legal lexicon. But he used the word compassion again and again, and acting with compassion was probably the most important of those guidelines. If the person acted with compassion, then a great deal of leeway was there in terms of not prosecuting somebody who compassionately helped another person to end their life. Compassion was beginning to be noticed. Indeed, in my time, I've tried to use the word compassion and the concept of compassion as being central to good medical ethics. Now, I understand that people will derive that from different sources, and I don't remotely start lecturing my colleagues on where I get the concept from. The word compassion is there in the Quran. Every chapter but one begins with the invocation to God, to Allah, the all-compassionate, the all-loving. It's a strong part of the Jewish Bible. It's a strong part of Buddhism. And my humanist secular friends have no problems usually with using the word compassion either. I will say I'm not concerned as a Christian ethicist to make sure that all doctors become Christians and then work out their ethics. On the contrary, I want people to be ethical whether they're Christians or not. Compassion seems to me to be a concept that is important in medical ethics, deeply important. It doesn't resolve issues, but it does tell you the starting point for proper medical ethics. If you don't feel compassion for the people you're talking about when you're talking about medical ethical decisions, then it seems to me you've started on the wrong foot. Compassion, reaching out to somebody in need and being determined to help them if at all possible, seems to be absolutely essential to good medical practice. I then looked and saw there was quite a bit of anger in those stories. It was pretty passionate stuff. One word, Greek word used, which occurs in one of the stories, says that Jesus, and the Greek word means snorted like a horse. It's a lovely metaphor, isn't it? Snorted like a horse is the meaning of the Greek word. The exasperation that some other people weren't reaching out to this person. Anger perhaps at the disease itself and the condition of the person. There's quite a lot of touching in terms of dangerous touching people who are deeply polluted. The story of the lepers, where Jesus actually touches the leper. I mean, in terms of the understanding of leprosy in the Jewish Bible, in the Old Testament, and carried through into the New Testament, this was something you really, really, really don't do, is touch a leper. If you do, you're going to be polluted, ritually polluted. It's not about germs, it's got nothing to do with germs, it's about pollution. You are deeply polluted. One person described this as a bit like, okay, you're sitting in a park and some rather drunk and extremely smelly tramp comes and sits next to you. And you're not going to catch germs from that person, but you're going to feel pretty uncomfortable, I think. That begins to get something of the feeling of what pollution is about. I suppose that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses fear in terms of blood transfusions. It's that they're actually going to be polluted by in their own strange reading of the Old Testament text involved, they really believe that they are going to be polluted. And sometimes I say to doctors who get agitated when a Jehovah's Witness refuses blood and that blood will actually save that person's life, I said, well, wait a minute, see it from their perspective. You're trying to save their life. What they're worried is about their soul, because they believe that blood will deeply pollute them, and that's going to affect their eternal life, not just this life. Now, you don't share those beliefs, and I don't either, but that's where they're coming from. Pollution is a very strong notion, but Jesus actually defies that and touches the people who have leprosy. We know it's not leprosy in the modern senses. Who knows what it is? But it was thought to be deeply polluting. So this anger, this care, this passionate care for and about the other person. That again certainly is a second feature of many of the stories. Passion, passionate care. So compassion and passion, or if you want to combine the two, compassionate care. Feeling strongly, sometimes angrily, in that context. Then another feature which you will be familiar with, because you'll have heard it so often, is that it says in the stories, in at least 3 of the stories, your faith has made you whole, or your faith has saved you. Much depends on how you translate that. Your faith has made you whole. faith is pretty important in most of the stories. Faith, at one level, seems to me to be an essential part of good medical relationships. If you have no faith in your doctor, then your doctor's probably not going to be able to help you too much. And the doctor's got to have some faith in you as well, particularly if he's treating you properly in terms of autonomy. Some sort of faith, at least in terms of minimal trust, seems to me an important part of healing relationships. But it's also a bit more than that. There really have been quite a number of studies now on the relationship between faith, religious faith, and illness. Much of them American studies, as you might expect, but some with plenty of British studies as well. There's quite clear in the literature, and it's complicated literature, but and I won't bore you with all the details, but actually having religious faith is quite good for your health. In all sorts of areas, not just in psychosomatic areas or even purely psychological ones, but even in terms of things like heart condition and so forth. Which isn't to say that you're going to live forever, but people who are religious tend to be somewhat healthier than those who are not. It's a quirky finding because it also means that they live longer, which I always say couldn't be more quirky really, since religious people often believe that we're going to have life beyond this life, so we actually end up living this life a bit longer. And it certainly isn't true for all of us. It's a probability, it's a statistical probability, but a fairly well-established one now. And it could be that any kind of faith is going to work that way. So somebody like Richard Dawkins obviously has faith, enormous faith in his science and all the rest of it, and treats it like a religion. That's probably quite good for him as well. It'll probably keep him going for years. Well, we'll see. But at a more serious level, it does seem to me that finding can be grossly overused. It's a bit like marriage, really. Commending marriage because it actually makes you happier, and a successful marriage actually does add to your lifespan as well, isn't very convincing, is it, to people who don't believe in marriage? Nor is saying that, I used to tease my secular colleagues sometimes in university and say, well, if you went to church and had faith and so forth, you'd actually be healthier and you'd probably live longer. No, he says to me, going to church every week, it's not worth it. So life might be longer, but it would feel a lot longer than that. No, it's a highly instrumental understanding of faith and religion, which seems to me to be an appalling reason for being religious. But there is a connection, an interesting connection, that is pretty well established now in terms of the literature. But just at the very minimal level, even if we don't treat this as religious faith, even if we just talk about trust, trust seems to me to be an important part of the healing relationship in terms of doctor and patient. Then the fourth element that I noticed was this, and you'll be aware of this, that healing stories often end in a peculiar way, because Jesus says to them, person who's been healed, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Now this has puzzled scholars for many years, and there have been all sorts of theories about what is actually involved in this. I wasn't really so interested in these theories because I was trying to look at the healing relationship. What does don't tell anyone mean there? Well, actually, one of the things you observe is crowds. And Jesus sometimes when before a healing, he says to the crowd, go away. The pressures from the crowds in the stories are really very considerable. In Mark's Gospel, you can see Jesus sometimes having to go in a boat and escape the crowds and their demands. And he goes to a place and they make excessive demands upon him as a healer. And I began to think, well, actually there is a difference here between the kind of televangelist who put up great signs and say, come and see the miracles happen. Do you remember some of these individuals? Actually, if you listen to the gospel story this morning, there was a bit of that in it, wasn't there? There's this young slave girl who was clearly making money for her owners, since they thought they owned her, who had healing powers, or at least divination powers. Well, no doubt they were advertising her wares like mad, and they were furious when Paul invokes the Holy Spirit and she loses those powers. But wait a minute, Jesus seems to me to be exactly the opposite of all of that. Healing, it seems, again and again, is a response in compassion to a person in need. And telling the person afterwards, no, don't tell anyone, the usual response at the end of that seems to me to saying something important. Something about not making those kind of claims that the wonder worker makes. There's an element of reticence right at the end of all the stories, which is unexpected, but it makes more sense in a healing context. Because I'm certainly aware that doctors can claim too much and patients can demand too much. If there was ever a solution to the problem of rationing, I think it lies in that kind of context, where doctors don't claim too much and where patients don't demand too much. An element of reticence in terms of what a good healing relationship is about. And certainly that's how I understand that in the context of the healing stories. So what I had then was a pattern of a typical healing story. 4 features, starting with compassion, continuing with deep and passionate care, talking about faith, and finally ending on a note of reticence or humility or restraint. Now, I couldn't find many of those things actually in the sort of usual paradigm for healthcare ethics. And certainly in my work, since I did that study, I've seen that as my primary focus. To try in these various bodies, where I'm a member and the only theologian present, to get them to see this bigger picture, which isn't just about choices, it isn't just about personal autonomy, it isn't just about not harming and doing good, or even justice, which I think is a much stronger notion. It actually involves these other things as well: compassion, passionate care, faith or trust, and reticence or restraint, or humility. I see those as complementing the other values, not as destroying them. More important still, I see them as deepening it. Deepening it. It seems to me that what is often lacking in ethics is the really deep and passionate reasons for doing something. I just finished a book for Cambridge University Press on moral passion and Christian ethics. What I do is I go through all sorts of thinkers and all sorts of theorists, and I ask myself a simple question. Would their theory really drive somebody passionately to do something for other people at their own expense, at their own cost? My example is not from medical ethics at all, but from Noel Shavas. Does anybody know about Noel Shavas? He's one of the only 3 people, a doctor, to have been awarded the Victoria Cross twice, and I think of those 3 persons is the only person to have won the Military Cross as well. Now, he was a doctor during the First World War. He won both of his VCs during the First World War, and he died before he could receive the second. Now, he was working as a doctor in a battlefield context, and what astounded people at the time was that he would take parties out again and again under fire, rescuing those who'd been wounded, despite being wounded himself several times, and eventually fatally so. Now, I asked myself, what actually drives somebody to do that? To act in that kind of hugely altruistic way, of actually beyond common sense almost, to help other people? what I concluded is that almost all the ethical theories I was looking at, if they didn't have some kind of faith component in them, really didn't answer my question. They could tell me how you balanced up these decisions. They could tell me how you might be encouraged to be cooperative with your neighbours and so forth. All they didn't tell me about was the kind of moral passion at the heart of an individual like that. And that fits in very strongly with my notion of compassion, compassionate care, that I think is important in medical ethics. Well, I've talked for 3/4 of an hour now, and I want to stop at this point because we said we'd have tea. I'm happy to ask questions on that, and I'm happy also for you to ask me questions, if I can answer them, about some of the difficult ethical issues. I haven't talked about them in particular. I've merely referred to them in passing. So, we'll stop at this point. Yeah?